In this speech, I'll discuss why churches aren't taxed, why churches should not be taxed, and lastly, the effects of taxation. For many years, people have asked why churches in the United States of America are tax exempt. Some even go the distance to protest and lobby for churches to in fact be taxed. But if churches were to suddenly be taxed, there would be many community-related problems throughout the U.S., which I will go into further detail. Not only that, but if churches were to be taxed, it would endanger the freedom of speech, which is protected in our Constitution. Now, more specifically, why and how are churches protected and exempt from taxation? In the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, by Establishment Clause, there is a clear separation between the church and the state. One of the basic human rights protected by our Constitution is the freedom of speech. Within that right is the right to practice any religion of your choice. Before the United States became its own country, the number of countries that allowed freedom of religion were slim, to say the least. One of the reasons being the limitations put on churches resulting from taxation, most notably in England in the early 18th century. Now, if churches were to be taxed, it can endanger the practice of free expression of religion, which would contravene the Exercise Clause previously stated. Chief Justice John Marshall once stated that the power to tax involves the power to destroy, that the power to destroy may defeat and render useless the power to create. An excerpt from the Los Angeles Times says, "Churches are tax exempt under the principle that there is no surer way to destroy the free exercise of religion than to tax it." An analogy of this is if a person defaults on a loan, that individual or organization may be subject to penalizations or possibly be even shut down. The exact same concept is true for churches, which was confirmed by the Supreme Court ruling of McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. Along with that statement, if a single religion is taxed, every religion must be taxed as well. Following that, all nonprofits and charities would have to be taxed. Now, you may be wondering why charities are tied in with churches. The answer is somewhat simple. Their tax exemption relies on the social services that they are involved with. Both charities and churches fall under category 501c of the International Revenue Service. Now what does 501c mean, and what are the requirements? According to Investopedia, there are two requirements. The first requirement states that they must be organized and operated exclusively for charitable, scientific, religious, or public safety purposes. The second requirement is they must collect income and turn over the entire amount minus expenses to the organization or individuals who are lawfully recognized as legitimate charities. Now that we have the requirements, let's dig deeper into what 501c actually is. According to the Foundation Group on 501c3.org, Section 501c is a portion of the U.S. Internal Revenue Code that allows for federal tax exemption of nonprofit organizations, specifically those that are considered public charities, private foundations, or private operating foundations. It is regulated and administered by the U.S. Department of Treasury through the Internal Revenue Service. Now, from the same source, it states unique provisions of 501c. Unique provisions tend to vary by state, like federal law. Most states allow for deductibility of state income tax purposes. Also, many states allow 501c organizations to be exempt from sales tax on purchases as well as exemption of property taxes. Now let's discuss the contributions of churches and how taxation would affect them. Without a doubt, churches are the ones to thank for a very large portion of community programs and charities. In 2014, churches across the U.S. were estimated to have received more than $114 billion in donations. If that number would have been taxed, it would fall to roughly $72 billion. To put that into perspective, the United States poverty spending in 2015 was $1.03 trillion. Therefore, churches received and boosted spending by 11%. That number would have fallen below 7% if taxed, which is a significant decrease. There are many poor and disadvantaged individuals and families that rely on the services of the church. After speaking to my own pastor, he said that our church only has a 10% overhead, which tends to be an average overhead for many churches. But if they were to be taxed for donations, federal, state, property, taxes, etc., all available spending would be cut by more than half. There would not be enough funds to pay for projects like Oak Ridge and Edmond, mission trips to India, New York, Chicago, and many more. Food and clothing distributions, such as Project 66, would also take large financial hits. One of the first arguments that people have is that churches are given more lenient treatment compared to nonprofits, which in itself is unconstitutional. In response, most charities must report donations and stability to IRS with a 990 tax form. Churches earn their exemption through their public works. Churches, just like charities, complete services that the government otherwise would have to do by obligation. The second argument is that tax exemption for churches forces even non-religious people to support said institutions. Now, if the government were to tax them, it would place the government above religion, which was confirmed in court to be the case. Taxation would allow the government to shut down and seize church property. If churches get taxed, every nonprofit organization must also pay taxes. In conclusion, there are many reasons the church should not be taxed. Churches of all religions are protected by our Constitution and rules guided by the IRS. Whether or not you are religious, it is hard to deny the positive impact churches have on our society. Without the services provided by churches and nonprofit organizations, many communities would reap negative results, hindering their ability to grow.